Hi everyone, today I'm doing a tutorial on how to actually go about making a game card in Photoshop. Something a little bit different this time. A friend of mine wanted to ask me how I would go about doing this, and so I thought I'd do a quick tutorial just to show that process. I personally don't play a lot of card games, but rather than showing how to design one of these cards, I wanted to show how you might construct it in Photoshop. So the first thing I do is I start to lay out the composition of the card and create a bit of a template. And to do that, all I'm using is the selection tool to drag out different selections and right-clicking that selection and filling it with a particular color or value. And I do that each section on separate layers, and making sure that I keep each section separate. So pretty much just like with my artwork, I start everything out fairly simple, focusing on the general composition, and that's just so that I can get a good idea about how the card is actually going to look. And from there I continue to add detail and extra elements such as color, but again, that's just icing on the cake really. You got to make sure that the base is correct and that the composition is solid before you add in all the pretty stuff like the artwork, the color, and the text. So you can see over to the right there, I'm using a reference image which I'm pretty much going to replicate. And obviously if you want to make your own card game, it's probably a good idea not to rip off someone else's design and to just use your own. But at least if you know how to construct a card such as this in Photoshop, you can pretty much construct anything really. So again, I think layer hierarchy at this point is quite important, and I suggest that you would label your layers just to prevent confusion, and especially later on the number of layers substantially increases as you keep working on this, and it's very easy to get confused. And it's just time saving, you know. You don't want to be wasting time trying to figure out what layer you're on and what layer you want to work on, and etc, etc. So now what I'm doing is I'm just creating that organic look to the secondary border you see there in the card, that red section. And that's pretty easy. All I'm doing to create that is using the basic brush, basic hard round brush, and I'm just sketching it in. It doesn't have to be perfect, I guess. A steady hand will help, obviously, but you can see there I'm not putting too much thought into or too much effort into ensuring that it's perfectly you know, vectorized or anything like that. Of course, it's up to you and what you want to go for. I'm sure if I was indeed to use this card for a project of my own, I would definitely put the time into making sure it was perfect, but for this tutorial I was kind of rushing through it, and got an okay result in the end anyway. So you can see that every kind of layer I've separated. So the top layer, for example, would be the border, and you know, the second top layer would be the secondary border, then the title, then the artwork, etc, etc, etc. And so just think about your layer hierarchy, what needs to be above other particular areas, and so on and so forth. It's going to make it a lot easier to work. So what I did there was just organize all those layers into a folder, again to make it easier to manage. And I've imported the artwork onto a layer which is sitting beneath all the other layers. And to actually get it to come through, what I've done is I've selected the template artwork layer, and I've taken the opacity of that layer right down to 0. And the abilities and title layers, template layers, I've actually just taken down the opacity a little bit, not completely, but just a bit, just to show the artwork through a little bit. Make it a bit translucent. And now, using that artwork, I'm creating a color palette for the rest of the card, a color scheme that I'm going to use, and that's mainly going to consist of blues and oranges, which make up the artwork. And you want to try and keep your color scheme consistent so that the colors go together nicely. Just like with artwork, color schemes do play an important role in making something look good. So what I'm doing there to actually fill in the color is I'm just control and clicking the layer that I want to fill, and right click, fill, making sure that I've got the color selected that I actually want to fill that selection with. And what you see there is the layer style dialog box, and to get that to pop up, you simply double click the layer that you want to edit, and it'll pop up with a range of options that I've used to actually create the different effects for the different sections of this card. So, for example, the black outline that you see around that organic border that I've created for the abilities was basically created in the layer styles menu using the stroke. So go into layer style, make sure you have stroke ticked on, and pick a thickness. That's really a personal choice, and whatever you like, just, you can preview it obviously in Photoshop, so whatever is to your liking. I think I picked about a 3 or a 4 for this particular example, and then I just added a drop shadow to that layer, and that was pretty much it. That's how I got that effect. Of course, to get that to work properly, that layer has to be separated from all the other layers, and its position needs to be in the appropriate place on the hierarchy in the layers menu. So now I'm creating that little icons for the abilities, using the selection tool again to fill it in with a particular color. And I'm actually creating this on a layer above that initial template for the abilities, and that's just to keep everything separate and workable. So I've created a base for that icon, and then I've created another layer above that icon, filled it with another darker color. In this case, I'm using the same color scheme as the dividers on the card, so the yellow and the maroon color. And then I created another layer above that, and which created the middle of that little icon. And keeping the layers separate allows me to kind of use the airbrush to fill in the shadows and the highlights on each section of that icon. So now I'm selecting the middle layer and adding some highlights and shadow to that. And the top layer, which is the middle of our icon there, I went into its layer styles, added an inner shadow, and adjusted that appropriately. And that was pretty much it. So again, to get the layer style menu to pop up, you want to double click the layer and it'll pop up with a whole bunch of options that you can use to actually make changes to that layer. So obviously there's a whole bunch of things that you can play around with there, such as glow effects, drop shadows, emboss, and whatever else you really want to use to edit the layer. But it's a pretty cool little tool, and it's one of the main things I used in this tutorial to get the different effects for my for the different sections of my card. Now I'm just creating that icon for the ability. All I did was use the text tool to create a font, or sorry, the text tool to create that, and rasterized it, and now I'm just editing it appropriately using the transform tool, duplicating the layers. It's pretty simple stuff, very basic Photoshop tools that I'm using here to create this card. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, hitting Control-T on the keyboard will bring up your transform tool, which I've actually been using to rotate those icons. Of course, that's only going to work if each of those eyes are on separate layers. So now I'm creating the second ability icon, and all I've done for that one is created a selection with the Eclipse tool, right click and hit stroke, and that's how I've got that yellow outline for the selection. And I've given it a thickness of about 8 in this example. Then I double click that layer, go into the layer style, and add an inner shadow, which creates the illusion that it's actually digging into the card. Adding some highlight effects, just using the airbrush there. If you want to work exclusively on a particular layer, just control click that layer, and it will actually select everything on that layer. And then Control H will hide the selection, but simultaneously have what you just selected. So it's kind of like masking in a way, but on the fly. Now I'm just drawing in that little icon there for the ability, and I'm literally drawing it in with just that basic hard brush, and you know, of course, keeping it as neat as possible, but again, I wasn't really too fussed about neatness when creating this stuff. As far as I'm concerned, the icon is that small that it really doesn't matter if it's perfect or not. No one will be able to tell anyway. So I'm cleaning it up a little bit. I mean, you still do want to keep it as neat as possible, but I'm certainly not going to bother using the line tool. Now I've created a layer above that line art and filled it in with white, again using the basic hard brush. Now I've merged those two layers together, and I'm using the transform tool to adjust that icon appropriately. Making just adjusting, tweaking the layer style there a little bit. So you can see how keeping those various icons separate, I can actually switch those layers on and off, which is pretty cool. And I'm using that icon that I created before, or at least the border for that icon, and I'm just duplicating it and using it for the next icon, the bottom icon, which is really time saving actually. and something you definitely want to do where you can, because obviously if you were to work on something like this commercially, or you were hired to put together cards in Photoshop, time is money, and you want to take shortcuts where you can. Um, Obviously, not too many at the expense of quality. But again, I'm just sketching in that other icon, and it's pretty fast and easy to do, and I'm keeping it neat enough, I guess. To get that black outline there inside the icon, all I did was again use the ellipse tool and right click, stroke, picked black for the stroke color, and that was pretty much it. And that's the icons done. So a lot of this stuff is just really using the selection tool, going into the layer style and adjusting what I need to in there, using the basic brush tool occasionally, and that's basically all there is to it. The only other real thing that you have to take note of is obviously the layers and where they're sitting on the hierarchy, because a lot of this stuff is to do with layers. You know, you're going to be overlaying different sections of the card, and it's important to make sure that you're naming the layers properly to stop confusion, and just taking note of where they're sitting in the hierarchy of the layers list. So I picked an appropriate font for the text, and I used the title text and pretty much duplicated that, dragged it down into the description area, and I'm just using that in order to keep the rest of the card text consistent pretty much. If I can get away with duplicating layers that I've already worked on, then I will, for sure. Again, just to save time. I mean, there's no use in doing the same thing 2 or 3 times over, when I could have simply just cloned it and done a little bit of tweaking. So I'm trying to come up with a bit of a description there, just the functionality of the card really. Again, I don't play card games that much, so I'm not really sure what works and what doesn't work, and whether this card would, could potentially be used in a game. This tutorial is really just about how I'd go about constructing it. I've played a bit of Magic and a bit of Yugi-Oh before, but still, I wouldn't say I'm very knowledgeable in actually constructing these cards and knowing what makes them work and what doesn't make them work. But hey, I'll show you how to construct the idea. I'll show you how to construct the concept. So sometimes you'll find these little kind of quotes at the bottom of cards, like Magic cards, and I always thought they were really cool, so I couldn't help myself. I had to create a cheesy quote for this one as well. I actually probably spent longer thinking about what I was going to write for this quote than I should have, but I guess it was one of the most important elements for me in this case. So the artwork I used for this card was actually just an old painting that I'd done, an old digital painting that I'd done last year or the year before or something. And what happened there was Photoshop actually crashed Luckily I didn't lose all my work. Photoshop CS6 has got this nifty little backup recovery system now, which thank goodness they've finally incorporated into the program. I think this is the first version of Photoshop that actually has a recovery system. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing worse than having your Photoshop crash and you lose all this work only to have to redo it over again. Nothing worse. So I was lucky enough to recover my work, and continue on with it. So even if you were to construct just a simple card and apply the different techniques that I've been showing you guys, it'd probably help you to get your knowledge up in this stuff. Again, it's really basic Photoshop stuff, but once you get the hang of it, and it is quite easy to get the hang of it. You can pretty much design any card and construct it using these techniques. So I'm just drawing in the icons that you can see over to the right on the reference, the different abilities. I'm not sure at all what they stand for. I'm guessing that some of the icons are for the strength of the card, how much attack they deal, how much armor they have, and how much punch they pack. I really don't know, but I just draw all of these out, and of course you could use the pen tool and the selection tools to create something which is perfectly nice, neat, and crispy. But I just decided to use the basic brush tool. Like I said before, if you don't have a steady hand, it's probably a better idea to use something like the pen tool. But I'm just as comfortable using the basic brush tool. It seems faster to me as well. So, for example, this, I think it's supposed to be some kind of fist. I kind of sketched it out in the beginning, and then I actually created a layer above that one and redrew it just to neaten it up a little bit. So in the end, it doesn't really matter how this stuff is executed as long as the end result looks decent. It's the same with painting a piece of concept art, or modeling a 3D character or whatever it might be. It really doesn't matter how you go about it. Obviously, as long as you're not tracing and stealing other people's work and calling it your own. But do whatever you need to do in order to execute your design and present it. So I'm just adjusting the size of those icons there to fit them all in together. Again, to make any adjustments to the size or the deformation of a layer, just hit Control-T and that'll come up with a whole bunch of transform settings such as rotate, scale, and move. Just creating the shield icon. Just mirroring it to the other side to get it perfectly symmetrical. And just as with the little hand icon that we created for the ability in the top left hand corner of the card, I I create a layer beneath the line art, and I just fill it in with pink for the fist there. Attempting to make that little heart icon there to look a bit more like a crystal. Give it a bit of a crystal material. And to do that, I'm just using the selection tool and the airbrush. Again, if you want to hide your selection, Control H on the keyboard will do that. And then to deselect, Control D will deselect your selection. So yeah, it's pretty easy to do this stuff in Photoshop. Photoshop has some awesome tools available to us when we're working on this kind of thing. Of course, other programs like Illustrator and even Painter, I'm sure you could do pretty much the exact same thing and pull off the exact same effects. But I've just stuck with Photoshop over the years, and it seems to do all that I need it to do thus far. So now for each of those icons, I've gone into the layer style properties and added a stroke. Now I'm going in again and adding an outer glow for them, and just making the necessary adjustments that I need to do in order to get the effect that I'm after. Adding some numbers on top of those icons, and again, those numbers are going to have to be above, on a layer above those icons in order for me to see them. So I keep on saying this, but layer hierarchy when constructing something like this is very important. And really, guys, that's pretty much all there is to it. Once you practice it a few times, it'll all make sense. I'm going to try and replicate that little icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the reference card. Just drawing it out as I would with any other image. And on a layer below that line art, so you can see I just created the layer below it, and I'm just going to fill it in with yellow. Maybe add a bit of shading to it. And I mean, if any of you guys have ever done comic book art in Photoshop, this stuff is probably fairly familiar to you. It's the same process. Just creating the line art, filling it in. And that's pretty much it. So I hope everyone got something out of that, and I'll see you all next time.